Welcome to the show. We all know that Karl Marx taught devilish doctrines, but was he possessed? What about the diabolical side of Karl Marx and his protégés? A new book has uncovered all kinds of evidence that suggests something very disturbing. We're going to talk about all of this with its author, Dr. Paul Kengor, author of this fine book. This episode brought to you by Coffin Nation. Go there. We talk about the DNA damage to the culture done to the culture that needs to be repaired. We talk about marriage and porn addiction, the founding documents of America, and what's at stake in saving the West. What's the West anyway? We do live webinars, lots of discounts on merch, like the merch that we have here. I'll just tease it there, including t-shirts and mugs. Find out what Coffin Nation members get all over the world. As promised, so happy to have back my friend and mentor, Dr. Paul Kengor. He teaches political science at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, as the author of some 20 books or something like that at this point. The Pope, the President, John Paul II, and President Reagan, sort of a double biography. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Communism, Dupes, Takedown. His latest book is just a barnstorming, amazing book. It's called The Devil and Karl Marx. Flashing it right now for the YouTube. Paul, welcome back to the show again.
Thank you, Patrick. Maybe it's a barn burning look in this case, right? You're very kind, and yeah, this is not exactly the most cheerful reading in the world. But I got to tell people, it wasn't the most cheerful researching and writing either. But alas, here we are.
Well, one of our taglines inside Coffin Nation is "We go there," and this book goes there.
Yeah.
I thought, because I'm full disclosure, I'm writing a book for Sophia Institute Press on isms, ideologies that threaten the church and the world. My first chapter. Good. Yeah, thanks. It's on Marxism. The first chapter, the overarching category of Marxism, under which I put communism, socialism, democratic socialism, and what it looks like on the ground through activities of groups like. Antifa. Excellent. And Saul Alinsky. But I didn't expect your book to go from the starting line to the finish line. Karl Marx's family of origin, the disastrous things that happened to his family, particularly to his daughters. Wow. Two of them ended up in a suicide pact with their spouses. You want to use words like diabolical and curse and devilish, but you not only start there, and I'm going to rewind soon and talk about Marx himself, but also how his ideology got entrenched in places like Bolshevik Russia, and how the dominoes of Russia's errors, in light of Our Lady of Fatima's message, Russia will spread her errors. This is the fundamental error. This is the original sin error, if you will, that gave rise to the actual sins of far left-wing militarized communist governments, and you detail them here in the book. But also, you talk about current news and names that are currently in currency. I'm reading Bella Dodd's book, School of Darkness, and I thought, I wonder if he's going to get into the question of the famous quote of hers that she said somewhere that she had led 1,000 or 1,200 communist men into Catholic seminaries, and then boom, you have this deep dive into that more modern story. And of course, the story of my personal father, Fulton Sheen, and his fight against communism. But let's start with the first question, because the topic itself is so difficult, and because there's going to be pushback and lots of slings and arrows, vitriolic opposition to books like this. Why did you decide to take on the big man himself?
Well, Patrick, I've known about this stuff for years, and this stuff, not just the sort of diabolical nature of communism, Marxism, but what Marx has written about the devil and his poetry and his plays. And in fact, I'll just briefly quote one that I open up with. This is one stanza, and that's it. He wrote this. This is called The Pale Maiden, 1837. Thus heaven I've forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell. And that is, I say this very carefully in the book. And in fact, I went through and I was rereading this a couple of hours ago, and you always go back through and read your own book, right, to take notes and everything, to prep and talk. I think it's on page 53. And there's a page where I say, look, it's hard to know when Marx is being autobiographical, when he's putting himself in the place of the devil, if he's projecting a character here, if he's talking about it's hard to know. And so I try to be really careful in saying, look, we don't want to overstate this. This is not a telltale sign that, wow, Karl Marx was possessed. Wow, Karl Marx was a Satanist. Although I quote people who say that, and biographers who said that. Richard Wurmbrand wrote the book Marx and Satan, and he was a Romanian pastor who, hey guys, he was tortured for 14 years in communist prisons. I give him some flack. I read some Marx biographers who just torched this poor guy, and it's like this guy even said, I was tortured by communists who, when they were torturing me, were yelling, "I am the devil!" Right? He said that all the circles in Dante's Inferno cannot describe what it's like to be tortured in communist prisons, life in communist prisons. So he wrote that book, Marx and Satan. There was a biographer by the name of Robert Payne, who was British. He might have written more Marx biographies than anybody in the modern era. He wrote one in 1968, one by Simon and Schuster, one published by New York University Press. British man of letters, scholar, man of the arts, translator, man who writes about poetry, about plays, and no right winger at all. I didn't know if this guy was religious. And I quote him in the book. He says something like, "It did seem at times like Marx may well have been possessed by demons. He seemed to have the devil's malignity, the devil's view of the world. It seemed as if Marx knew that he was doing the work of the devil." That's almost a verbatim quote of what Payne said. So I say, look, you don't want to overstate things. You also don't want to understate them. And Marx would have had to visit a priest and go through psychologists and theologians and everything for anybody to make the pronouncement that Karl Marx was possessed or that Karl Marx was a Satanist. So I lay all this stuff out. I report what other people have said. I quote what Marx had written, and you just read that, folks. All right. And I don't care how much of a leftist you are. I don't care how much you like Marx. If you actually sit down and read this stuff, you're going to say, well, I thought the professor who wrote this book's probably like a right-wing whack job, but I just read this, and this is pretty chilling stuff. And by the way, the anti-Semitism and the stuff about blacks and women, really bad, really bad. So it's at least going to cause you to reappraise and say, all right, okay, this wasn't a very nice dude, and he wrote some literally pretty chilling, incendiary stuff.
Where do we go after that? So many tributaries off that river, Paul. Marx was born into a Jewish family, and I was not aware that he identified as a Christian for some time as a teen. He alludes to it in that poem. Yes.
Yeah, he did indeed. He was born May 5th, 1818 in Trier, Germany. Now, Trier is spelled like Trier, Trier. And Patrick, this is profound. I mean, it is one of the most Christian cities, one of the most Catholic cities in all of Germany. It's where the cathedral in Trier, I was talking with somebody last week who's been there. It goes back to the 300s. It built, financed in part by Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine, right, of all people. She came back from the Holy Land, brought back what she believed was the crown of thorns, which is in Notre Dame today, brought back what she believed was the holy robe, the holy coat of Jesus that Jesus wore in the way to the crucifixion, that the Roman soldiers cast lots for. That's in the Trier Cathedral. They believe it's in the Trier Cathedral. St. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, was there, the one who brought Augustine into the faith. So in 320s, 330s, Marx grew up literally in the shadow of that cathedral. By the way, he was writing the Communist Manifesto, 1846, 1847, published in 1848, among other places, in Belgium, in the shadow of the great cathedral of Michael the Archangel, right? So a lot of association here.
Right. And there's another chilling, almost geographical aping of Catholicism there. If you look at communism as a kind of massive substitute for Catholicism, it has a founder, it has principles, it has fasting, it has a sense of sacrifice, except that it's all demonically inverted. I was not aware of Pope Leo XIII's prayer being composed there. Talk about that Belgian cathedral. That was an eye-opener.
Yeah, and by the way, Mikhail Gorbachev said too that it also has a set of canonical texts, right? Gorbachev said that. Yeah, and they engaged in their own crusade, their own holy war against religion. Ronald Reagan called it communism, that religion of theirs. But yeah, Pope Leo XIII, who had that amazing moment, right, where he went out. Some people think he maybe went to the passed on, right, and had this moment where he saw hell, he saw the other world, he saw the other side, and when he came back to, he composed the prayer to Michael the Archangel, right? Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And I might as well finish, right? Do thou, O heaven, the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. That's the prayer. That's the Michael the Archangel prayer. And there's Michael the Archangel Cathedral, and Marx is there with his friends in the Communist League composing, Patrick, what they called their Communist Confession of Faith. And Engels wrote to Marx. He said, give more thought to our Communist Confession of Faith. I think we should ditch the catechism form and instead just call it the Communist Manifesto. Right? There's all kinds of, indeed, aping and mocking of Christianity, of Catholicism, of the catechism. That's all there. But so Marx grows up in the most Catholic city in all of Germany. His father was Jewish. I talked to Dennis Prager about this, and Dennis Prager said, Paul, were they Orthodox Jews? And the family, because there are a lot of rabbis in the family, a number of rabbis. I said, I don't know that well enough. He said, well, I can tell you they were. He said, I do know that well enough. In other words, it's oftentimes, the more Orthodox Jews to this day. I mean, it's Orthodox Jews. When you see the breakdown and vote, like 70% of Jews voted Democrat, 30% voted for Trump. It's like Orthodox Jews are the 30%, right? I mean, they're still very conservative to this day. And so Prager, and so oftentimes it's the Reformed Jews that become more liberal, the Orthodox Jews. Usually it's the really solid Orthodox Jews who have been like the best anti-communists. And so it matters in Marx's case. Did he come from like Reformed Jews? Did he come from Orthodox Jews? It seemed to be a family of Orthodox Jews, but the father, Heinrich Marx, who referred to his son, he asked his son if his heart was governed by a demon. That's the title of the chapters in the book. 1837 letter from Heinrich to his son. And Heinrich converted to Christianity. And unlike his brother who converted to Catholicism, Heinrich, and biographers think, Patrick, that he probably converted in part because of social pressures against Jews in that day, in that era. But he
like converted. A converso, faux conversion, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. But I don't know. I mean, I always,
it's hard to parse out.
Yeah, biographers always say this stuff, right? Especially ones who don't understand religion very well. Like, oh, Ronald Reagan's dad, drunk, never went to church, apathetic Catholic. And then I find out he's a member of the Knights of Columbus, right? And his son was a daily communicant, Neil Reagan. Anyway, but with Marx, the father converted to Lutheranism, so he became a Protestant. And it even tells Mark, his son, he says, Karl, it's good to have faith. I've seen what this can do for people. It's good to have kind of the rudder of faith. But he's a Lutheran who reads Voltaire. He reads Voltaire to his son. And the son ends up becoming a Christian, but left Christianity in college under the influence, especially of a agnostic, atheistic philosopher, of a professor of religion named Bruno Bauer, who, among other things, was vehemently anti-Semitic and influenced Karl's bizarre anti-Semitism as well. Vicious I say bizarre because he was an ethnic Jew, but so Bruno Bauer influenced that too. I know I'm going all sorts of directions. I know you want to jump in with a question, but in case you don't ask this,
go ahead.
A really interesting part. Were you going to ask me about Luther?
No.
At all?
Nice try, guest. No, I wasn't.
Yeah. But Marx was appreciative of Martin Luther because he appreciated Luther breaking away from the church. Luther's breakaway from the church. Marx said the revolution started in the head of the monk, and now it will finish in the head of the philosopher. So even though Marx and Luther would have a fist fight, if you could put the two together, in the 1900s, and Luther would scream at him and wouldn't support Marxism, Marx appreciated that Luther made this crucial break away from the authority of Rome, which would allow people to start defining their own version of interpretation of scripture, and even so it's the kind of religious relativism that leads to a broader moral relativism that Marx seizes upon.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That parallel, you could do a whole 10-part video series on Marx and Luther.
Yeah,
parallels are kind of striking. And hey, they're both equal opportunity haters. If you read Luther's works on the Jews, I'm sure Karl Marx would do a high five.
Anti-Semitic. That's very true. Yeah.
When you were talking about the proposed title, The Confession of Faith of Communists, kind of modeled on a catechism, and their decision to not do that, that reminded me of something that you said. I'll jump ahead just a little bit here, and then we'll come back to Marx. You lay out some samples in your book from the original first draft schemas, they're called, of the Second Vatican Council, that are unambiguous, very strong, perhaps strident, like the voices of previous popes on communism and socialism, that were expunged, edited out. They did not make it into the four main documents of the council. The Ostpolitik of Paul VI, making a kind of a political rapprochement with communist governments, primarily the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Cardinal Mindszenty and people like him tortured. Unbelievable white martyrdom. Is there some dim parallel? Obviously not equating the Vatican Council documents with the Communist Manifesto, but the desire to domesticate something that might seem unpopular or seem to lessen the effect of what you want to get across. See where I'm going in the name change?
It was the start of a long period of silence, right? Kind of church imposed, Vatican imposed, Pope imposed, from John the 23rd through Paul the 6th, right? Were after Pius XII, where they take the approach of, let's not anger them, the communists. Let's not offend them, right? Let's not condemn them too harshly. They don't like that, right? That's going to make them mad, right? And so maybe the better way to get change with them and create a better world is to not offend them so much and have a kind of Ostpolitik, rapprochement. Basically, Paul VI is doing with Agostino Casaroli as well.
The Secretary of State under Paul VI, right?
Exactly. What Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were doing. And in fact, I don't think I have much on that in this book. In A Pope and a President, I talk about, and my friend Andrea DeStefano, who's a Catholic scholar, has done some great work on the parallels, on the friendship between Paul VI and Richard Nixon. It's very interesting. They were both pursuing they were both pursuing the same sort of accommodationist approach toward the Kremlin, and they learned where that got them, right? So much to the point where their successors, John Paul II after John Paul I, and eventually Ronald Reagan, they both reject détente, Ostpolitik, and instead pursue a policy of reversal, takedown, defeat atheistic communism. As John Paul II said, you need to learn to bang your fist on the table at these guys rather than accommodate them.
Imitatio Khrushchev.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's an interesting chapter there. The Logos and Divine Providence allowing all these terrible things so that greater goods can be drawn from them. You and I talked about this in a previous show on your book on John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, two very different but very kindred spirits who'd had enough of appeasement policies. Both gloves had to come off. Both men believed.
And I give an example in A Pope and a President where it's Casaroli's meeting with the Bulgarians, right? Like the Bulgarian leadership. And Patrick, it's sickening. It's like, oh, come on. You know who these guys are? You know who these guys are? And then within a handful of years after that, I have to go back and look at the Pope and the presidents, not more than 4 or 5 years. The Bulgarians are working. They put a bullet in John Paul II in the middle of St. Peter's Square on the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, 1981. It's like, oh, hey, how's that accommodation stuff working out for you, huh? So I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it just it didn't work. It didn't work.
The word duped comes to mind. I don't know why. Back, just lingering for a second on the parallels between Catholicism and communism. The founder of the Catholic Church gave his blood for the sins of other people, to forgive them. And because of that spilled blood, they get to live forever. So the one doing the sacrifice is the one who's victim and priest. On page 10, you point out, this is a line, when our turn comes, let me just back up a little bit. We have no compassion, and we ask no compassion from you. He writes, when our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for the terror. There's only one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth of the new can be simplified and concentrated, and that way is revolutionary terror, unquote. He's not hiding it, Paul. He's certainly not apologizing for it. So it's Antichrist. Yes.
Well, that's right, and it very much is Antichrist. It's very much, in fact, for Marx, right? The alpha and the omega was a material world based on economics, and this is what Pope Benedict XVI said. It's what John Paul II said. They envisioned this new Jerusalem where if you could simply solve the economic problem, right? If you could solve the money problem, then you could reach your new Jerusalem, your heaven on earth. But the failure, this, as JP2 would say, as Benedict XVI would say, this was an anthropological failure, right? Their failure to truly understand human nature. As Augustine said, Patrick, we have a God-shaped vacuum in our heart, not a dollar-shaped vacuum in our heart, right? As Jesus told Satan, man does not live by bread alone. But it's as if the Marxists think that, man lives by bread alone. Solve the bread problem. Solve the money problem, and everything will
and
be
then
okay.
We'll give you the bread.
But as rich people learn, money doesn't buy you happiness, and I find this all the time with people on the left and so many different things. A socialist and Marxist will be screaming, "All you care about is money and wealth," and it's like, no. Actually, that's all you care about, right? Marx's condemnation of Jews. What's the worldly god of the Jews? Money. What's the worldly god? Haggling, right? The bill of goods is the illusory exchange of Jews, and it's all money. All the guy thinks about is money.
Classic projection.
And like with so many people today in the political left who are identity politics, right? They say, well, we don't want to be judged by race. That's all they think about is race, right? It's like many of us thought we were finally behind this. We're finally behind. I have a mixed family, right? We have. I was at Chesapeake Bay recently. I don't think I've ever seen so many mixed race couples in my life. It was amazing to see. I thought we were finally past all of this stuff, and then here comes the left, right? It's the way they categorize people. The other one, you and I get this all the time. You hater, right?
Of course.
It's like, I'm smiling. I'm not angry at you. Hey, it's like, no, I think you're hating right now, right? But the Marxists did this, right? It was focused. Their God, right, was a golden calf, right? It was all about money, material. You destroyed the spiritual in favor of the material. So again, this is a long answer to your question. Antichrist. It is an antichrist view of the world.
Johnny Cash has a line in one of his songs. They want the kingdom of God without God in it. That's Marxism.
Yeah.
Messianic politics.
Yeah, but that's exactly right. That's right.
Kingdom of heaven is here. Right. You don't need to die to get it. Actually, people need to die. We need to kill them so that the revolution can happen for us.
And the proletariat would be like their redeemer class that would usher in the new utopia. So through the proletariat, you would have both the victim class and the redeemer class. And the goal of the Marxists always is to educate and enlighten, right? They call this a conscious raising, right? You need to explain to the proletariat why they're suppressed. By the way, oftentimes the proletariat says, get lost, we don't want you, man, right? And kind of all the different additional strands of Marxism that you see, gender Marxists, sexual Marxists, cultural Marxists. If you go to the website today of People's World, which is the successor to the Daily Worker, look at the About section. And they list all these different people that they're searching out. Cultural workers, LGBT people, people of color. It's all these different groups, right? So it's a constant search for a new victim class.
Yeah.
And the victim class has to be told why they're a victim. And then through the victim class, right, you can usher in this new revolution. And guys like you and I in our universal Catholic Church, we're like, hey, listen, we're all made in the image of God. We all have sanctity and dignity of human life. Quit putting people into categories. All right. This is divisive.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the Marxists divide. They put you in groups.
Another parallel there. I just thought about this. The proletariat drivers to seek out new victims are like an inverted demonic priesthood. They're the priestly class of evangelists, and they go out not to find the lost sheep, but to find the next victim class, to foment resentment and to inflame that resentment. You see this in Antifa as it plays out. Black Lives Matter movement, pure Marxism. BlackLivesMatters.com/what we believe. Don't believe me, believe them.
Yeah. Yeah, it says we support ending the, quote, Western prescribed nuclear family structure. And Patrice Cullors said, you can see it anywhere on the web, he said, Alicia and myself, meaning Alicia Garza, one of her co-founders, we are trained Marxist organizers. We are super versed in ideological theories. That's our ideological framework. And when I've been through this a whole bunch of times already, when you show this to people, they're like, whoa, well, who are you, Joe McCarthy? And they start calling. It's like, no, she's telling you what her world is, what her ideological framework is. That matters. It really matters.
Are you calling her a liar?
Yeah, right.
So you're calling her a liar.
Yeah, exactly.
Ulanem, the play he wrote.
Oh,
that's super creepy.
Oh man,
that might sell Marx as possessed even more than his creepy demonic poetry. Tell us more. I don't know what it is, but that's really kind of got under my skin, reading your account of it. An inversion of Emmanuel, God is with us. Tell us about a piece that he wrote.
Yeah, that is one of the most chilling things that I've read. So it's a Marx play that Marx wrote called Ulanem. So Oulanem. And it is the inversion of the name. And Robert Payne says this. And this is Payne's expertise. Richard Wurmbrand made a really big deal about it.
Paul Johnson, too, the British historian.
Yeah, Paul Johnson as well. Yeah, and in fact, Paul Johnson talked about this stuff in his book Intellectuals, which is, I don't know, probably maybe 30 years old at this point. And I've had a number of emails from people, usually people over the age of 50 or 60, who's like, oh yeah, I remember Johnson wrote about this, right? I remember Wurmbrand wrote about this. So, and this is important to note because Marx biographers, Patrick, they know this stuff, and they leave it out of their hagiographies.
Sure.
All right. This goes back to Franz Mehring, who was a German socialist, communist, Marxist, and he was the first real Marx biographer and collector of Marx's materials. And he found Marx's poems and plays. And he told Marx's daughter, Laura, he said, you should see to it that this stuff never gets published. Right? I mean, this is bad news, right? This is really disturbing stuff. And Laura passed it along to a nephew, and it was David Ryazanov of the Marx Institute in Moscow, a communist scholar who at least had the integrity to bring it out,
right.
Publish it for the first time. But the word Ulanem is an inversion of the name Emmanuel, which, as Jesus says to Mary at the Annunciation, right? You shall have a child, his name shall be Emmanuel. He will be a savior to the world. And so Marx apparently twists that name. And people watching right now, don't do this right now, but if you go into Google and you type in the word Ulanem, be prepared, right? First of all, you'll actually see a Wikipedia reference to it, which accurately notes that it was a play by Marx. And then if you see Google images, you'll see all kinds of satanic, dark, black stuff that you're just going to be, get off my computer screen.
I'm going to put that link with some caveats at patrickhoffman.media if you're listening. Also, everything that we talk about, book, resource, YouTube clip as well, I'm going to put there as a link for follow-up. Here is a portion of Ulanim. It's tempting not to go into this, Paul, but it's important that people see it in its own context, in their own words. This is Marx stating the omniscient narrator. Character says, Ulanim, Ulanim, the name rings forth like a death until it dies away in a wretched crawl. Yet I had power within my youthful arms to clench and crush you with tempestuous force. For us both the abyss yawns in darkness. You will sink down, and I shall follow, laughing, whispering in your ears, descend, come with me, friend.
Awful. I know. What do you make of it? And so the only question...
They should make it into a musical.
And so the only question there is, how much here is Marx role-playing? How much of it is autobiographical? How much speaks to his own point of view? How much is this him just writing about something else and he doesn't agree with it? By the way, that's not true at all. But there's a lot of this. All right. His poem, The Player, his poem, The Pale Maiden. I mean, I think I had a 30, 40-page chapter just on this stuff. And Richard Wurmbrand said of this, there is no support for the view that Marx entertained lofty social ideas about helping mankind. Marx hated any notion of God or gods. He determined to be the man who would kick out God. And you see that. You see that in plays like Ulanem, which is frightening. The one, The Pale Maiden, which I think is his love interest, Jenny, or at least that's how Payne interprets it. I mean, it's like a late night B movie horror flick, right? The sickly pale maiden in white, and she's going. It's like oh, it was good. But he was, and this needs to be understood. Marx fancied himself a poet. He wanted to be a poet. If he wouldn't have been a philosopher, he probably would have done poetry. And his favorite was Goethe's Faust, and especially the character of Mephistopheles, the Faustian bargain.
Shocking.
Yeah, right. And Marx had a favorite line. So many people said, Marx's friends, contemporaries, he could recite the words of Faust with gusto. Karl Heinzen, it was as if he was chanting the words of Faust. And he was particularly enthralled with a line from Faust where Mephistopheles says, everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. That's a guy who wanted to tear it down, burn down the house. And if there's any kind of comparison today to the sort of statue movement, right? Which started with Confederate generals. Were like, okay, I don't like the Confederate generals either. Then it goes to Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant. Then it goes to Lincoln. Then it goes to Frederick Douglass, right? Then it goes to Washington and Jefferson, right? Francis Scott Key, all of Mount Rushmore, right? Kind of on. But it's the idea of, and a family member said to me a few weeks ago, I see what they want to tear down, but I don't know what they want to replace it with. Neither do they. And a lot of times it's about standing in the embers of the burnt down building and just saying, yes, we won. Right? Say, well, what's next? I don't know.
Doesn't matter which statue.
Good. Right. Yeah. It's nihilism.
Sums it up. There's a great line from Chesterton. Never tear down a fence until you know why it was erected.
Yeah.
Did you know that we're going to get to Fulton Sheen and contemporary treatments of all this, opponents of communism. Fulton Sheen's probably the premier one in the Catholic context. He sat down with Pastor Wurmbrand.
Amazingly, I did not know that until somebody, I wish I would have seen that. Somebody, that 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's amazing. You've seen this as a writer, right? You think you know more on a subject than almost anybody, and you've written like 10 books on it, and you think you've seen everything. And then I think somebody put it up in the reader comment of an article I wrote, and I said, no, Sheen interviewed Wharton. No. Typed it in. Look at this.
Really fascinating. Put that in the show link also at patrickhoffman.media. So you can go to your own show notes, Paul, and watch it again. You've probably seen it since. But a lot of things hiding in plain sight. Most people aren't aware that Elvis Presley sang a song called "A Miracle of the Rosary," for instance. You can hear it on YouTube.
Wow.
What?
Did not know that.
The King wrote about the Queen? Well, here's page 118. This is another person who lived communism in the real world as one of its victims, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. Within the philosophical system of Marx and Lenin, hatred of God is the principal driving force, unquote.
Yeah.
Not a word wasted.
No, not a word wasted. And Marx, in his famous essay referring to religion as the opiate of the masses, the soul of soulless conditions, the heart of a heartless world, says the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. By the way, in that same essay, Patrick, he uses the word criticize or criticism 29 times. Probably the only word that he used more than criticism was the word abolish, right? Abolish religion, abolish the family. That's out of the Communist Manifesto, quote, abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare-up of this infamous proposal of the communists. Abolition of private property, Communist Manifesto, quote, the entire communist theory may be summed up in the single sentence. Abolition of private property. And then Marx says, and you accuse us of doing away with private property. Is that really what we want to do? Yes, it's exactly what we want to do. So he's all about criticizing, abolishing, and this idea that, well, Marxism is a pretty nice idea. It talks about loving and sharing and helping the poor. Nonsense. You have no idea what you're talking about.
I read with horror recently the pitiful, to call it naive is sort of to insult naivete, from America Magazine, The Catholic Case for Communism. If Pastor Wurmbrand could have read that rag.
I think that's
mind-blowing.
I think that's the worst thing that I've seen in a Catholic publication. I don't know, maybe ever. And I'm not one to beat up on America Magazine and the Jesuits.
That's my job.
I was so shocked that they ran that. That could have gotten them quite literally excommunicated. Certainly,
under former pontiffs, totally
they probably don't like it anyway. But under the papal decree in 1949, yes, by Pius XII, right? But really, any of the previous popes, maybe even Vatican II. And then when I read that piece, I thought, what is this? This is stuff that this is. I'm gonna insult the author. I won't mention his name. I know his name, but this is like junior high stuff. There's nothing new here. By the way, for that author, if you're watching me now, go into my book here, The Devil and Karl Marx. I know you probably don't want to buy it. You should read it though. Look, I read all of Marx. I read all that stuff, right? You can only learn if you read both sides, all right?
Right. Called a Catholic education.
Right. Go in this book and read the section where I quote Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker, because you quote Dorothy Day in that piece, The Catholic Case for Communism. Look at how Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker explains the communists with their outstretched hand effort to Catholics. Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker staff and her, they say, no, we cannot be communists because you guys reject this, and this. Okay, we might agree on helping the poor, whatever. Other than that, right, we cannot work together because there's too much that makes us different. Yours is an inherently atheistic, and that somebody in the year 2019, for a leading American Catholic publication, to publish that and write that, I was appalled. I was really shocked by that. That's really disappointing. That's a grand failure, and not just Catholic education, but education generally.
There's the same things have been thrown on to be thrown onto servant of God Catherine Doherty.
Yeah.
She worked with the poor and came out of communist Russia. She despised communism. She left them because of communism.
And I would tell, if they're watching now, if the author of that article is watching this now, when you go to this book, take a highlighter, color it red, all right, yellow, whatever, and just highlight all the instances of Marxists and communists saying things like communism and Christianity are incompatible. Okay. Marx said it, Engels said it, Lenin said it, Nikolai Bukharin said it. I mean, just for example, Marxists would disagree with what you wrote in that article. They say the Catholic case for communism. What? Are you crazy? And then go through and highlight in maybe a different color all the different encyclicals. All right, from Leo the 13th to Pius the 9th to Pius the 11th. I didn't even mention Pius the 12th to JP2, even to Pope Francis. Quote: Marxism is wrong. Go through all the cases from the magisterium of the Catholic Church saying, yeah, Christianity and communism, socialism and Christianity are irreconcilable.
Yes, this is key right here. Something you just said caught my attention, and I think it's important to highlight. The prophetic voice of the Catholic Church, in seeing the signs of the times and reading them, reading the zeitgeist, and reading things before they're off the ground.
Yeah.
As a thing. A good example is Pius IX's treatment of communism. Before Marx's book was written, the principles he laid down were already predicted and torpedoed. That's very interesting to me. Early 1840s.
That's amazing. 1846, Qui Pluribus, the first year of a 32-year pontificate, right, for Pius IX. And it is amazing. When I first read that, I thought, wow, Catholics believe that the Holy Spirit speaks through this magisterium, right? That this is Holy Spirit led. And I thought, if ever there was proof of that, I mean, it's like this guy was holding a crystal ball. I mean, again, I said 1846. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. And so that 1846 encyclical is predicting all the stuff that would happen. But by the way, it's even predicting attacks on marriage, the family, and I don't know if you have it in front of you, but they take their captives in private and they bind them and then they kill them. And at that point, I don't even think they were killing anybody yet, right? And so somebody might have said, oh, come on there, Holy Father, right. Bishop of Rome. They're really not killing anybody. Okay, but in 70 years henceforth, it would be the start of the Bolshevik Revolution with, according to the Harvard University Press book, The Black Book of Communism, at least 100 million dead from communism from 1917 to the 1990s, and still counting.
Right. You this is going into new territory that you cover in the book, Takedown, but I note a little whisper of that on page 120 here. You talk about the Bolsheviks immediately forbade religious instruction under anybody under 18. That kids were encouraged to turn to their parents. The parental / husband-wife relationship was infringed upon in multiple intrusive ways. Marriage was transformed into a strictly civil ceremony. Weddings and baptisms and funerals converted into bizarre communism events. Kill off the old, propagandize the young. Take the form of religion and twist it so that baptisms and the other sacraments can be diabolically co-opted for the party. Yeah. There's a kind of an evil genius to it all.
Yeah, there is. I mean, they didn't mess around with peripheral things, right? They went for the very foundation: religion, family, private property. The July 4th, 1826, Robert Owen, the American socialist, is standing there at his his colony in New Harmony, Indiana, and he declares war on what he calls the three-headed hydra, right? Of religion, marriage, and property, right? That's in America. Dan Flynn called him one of the early Yankee utopians. So these guys have all gone after marriage, religion, property, family. Patrick, they've been doing this for 200 years. They've been doing it for 200 years. And you know, and when people like you and I point out today, like, you know, Black Lives Matter refers to themselves as trained Marxist organizers. And if you go to their website where they use words like comrades in the about section, and it says that they're going after the, quote, Western prescribed nuclear family structure, we know what that is because we read the stuff. Right. We know what that means. Does it mean that it's not wrong to protest the death of George Floyd? Of course, what happened to George Floyd was awful, right? But that doesn't mean that you should thereby support the broader ideological goals, especially if they're Marxist oriented, right? Of an organization, you need to be smart.
The people who escaped from communism and the people who were reached while they were still inside and not necessarily trying to get out. I'm thinking of two people, Bella Dodd, I mentioned earlier, and Louis Boudin's, both of whom encountered the premier anti-communist thinker in America, Monsignor then Bishop Fulton Sheen, who had memorized the Soviet Constitution. There's a big FBI dossier on him. And he was protected by the FBI, of interest to them because of the Soviet hatred of him. Yeah. He was so embarrassing to them because he wouldn't quote Catholic sources, he would quote communistic sources to refute communism. I love the story of Mr. Boudin's. He and his wife discovered together they were both going to become Catholic, and it was because of this Sheen guy that they challenged in print, and then Boudin's was brought into the church while his name was still in the banner of the newspaper. Funny.
Yeah, while his name is on the banner, on the masthead of the Daily Worker. It's just beautiful. And yeah, he, his wife, and his two daughters, and this was during the Outstretched Hand by Earl Browder at Communist Party USA, where they tried to, quote, extend the hand of brotherly love to our Catholic brothers and sisters. And Sheen realized right. It was really, as Manning Johnson put it, a backhand, right? A hand with a dagger. As William Z. Foster, the other head of Communist Party USA, the predecessor to Bauer, said, we must liquidate, the liquidating of religious beliefs. But yeah, Boudin's challenged Sheen on this outstretched hand point, and he put out like a series of questions. And so Sheen said, yeah, I'll answer those questions, and I'll answer them strictly with the own language, straight from the horse's mouth, of Marxist literature and Soviet scholars and thinkers and Soviet officials. So yeah, it's a little book. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Communism Answers the Questions of a Communist, or something like that. It's footnote.
I'm going to snag it from my own book research. Yeah.
Sheen did a half dozen books like that, Communism and Democracy. And there's even things in books like Peace of Soul, where he also took on Freudianism.
Yeah.
And a big part of my book, The Devil and Karl Marx, are the Freudian Marxists.
Right.
Guys like Wilhelm Reich, who literally coined the term and wrote the book, The Sexual Revolution. Yes, but I digress.
Paul, Bella Dodd, I'm reading her book, The School of Darkness, this Italian-born Catholic family upbringing. She badly injured her foot, apparently. She had a lifelong limp. She was run over by a tram car.
I didn't know.
And she ended up at Columbia University, where she met young Thomas Merton, and that those radicals at the time, fellow travelers. I'm pretty sure there was overlap with Dorothy Day at the time. The fermented times of the 20s, they were sort of all in the same clique. Before Dorothy Day took baptism, and same with Thomas Merton, they left the anarchism and the communism behind. And yet there's sort of a scaffolding of urban legends surrounding Bella Dodd that she had ushered in or deployed, some say 1,000, some say 1,200 communists into seminaries. And as I'm reading your book, I thought, I wonder if he knows about Dr. Alice von Hildebrand. Boom, there you go into this deep research into what Dr. von Hildebrand has disclosed, the wife of the late, great Dietrich von Hildebrand. the philosopher. It's hard to argue, though, that she didn't say it, that Bella Dodd did not supervise in some way and help personally train and deploy 1,000+ seminarians to infiltrate the Catholic Church in America. It would certainly explain a lot. A lot of inchoate puzzle pieces click together when you ponder the possibility. I'll launch with that.
Yeah. Well, she had previously been an organizer for the New York State Teachers Union. Mm-hmm. And in fact, her job in the Communist Party, was to organize teachers. And she even says in School of Darkness that at one point she got literally 10% of their membership in their teachers union. 10% of all things. Mm-hmm. And also too, this is important for people to realize. I give this data in the book. It's a declassified FBI report. The half of all members of Communist Party USA in America lived in New York City, within several zip codes. So if you wanted to organize and find these people, that's where they were. And Communist Party USA, the height of its membership was the 1930s, which, Patrick, was probably anywhere from 30 to 60,000 members, maybe to 50 to 100,000. It was never above 100,000. But if you had 30, 50,000 communists in New York, and that's where she was, and that's where she was organizing from, and she was doing this with teachers, all right? And they were already trying to do this with Protestant seminaries. And they were doing this certainly in the Soviet world, in the Comintern, and later on in the 40s behind the Iron Curtain. The idea to her that what seems to us like crazy, wow, how could you get, quote, 1,000 communist men and place them in Catholic seminaries? I go through the data in the book of the number of priests in America at the time, the number of people who were in seminary, and you're talking like 30, 60,000, depending on seminary priests, who they were through this period. So 1,000 would not be unreasonable. It would not be far-fetched. And people, listen, okay? You can look for it all you want on the internet. We do not have audio of Bella Dodd saying this, okay? Yeah. And I've read these YouTube videos. Please stop creating stuff like this. It hurts your credibility. Where you have Bella Dodd talking in a speech where she's giving it at Fordham, Utica, maybe, I don't know, okay? But it's her voice, and I'm watching, and I'm reading through, and then it stops, and then you put across the screen, I placed 1,000 comments. She doesn't say that. She's not saying that. Don't do that. That's misleading. Yeah, it really hurts your. Don't do that. But we do have Ellis von Hildebrand, who knew her. Fulton Sheen must have heard this from her. I quote him on this. A woman named Janine Leininger, who did a sworn affidavit saying that she heard Bella say this. Bella seems to have said it. And so then the big question is, did she succeed in doing it? I don't know. But I think that they definitely tried. By the way, I still have not been able to get, Patrick, Bella Dodd's FBI file.
You did a Freedom of Information Act. What happened?
I did a FOIA request. She's been dead for over 50 years. I've got FBI files on people from Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers to the Rosenbergs to Obama's mentor, Frank Marshall Davis, even Harry Hay, the leading gay communist. But we do not have Bella Dodd's FBI file to this day. I want to read it. I want to see what it says. I bet that stuff is in there somewhere.
Have you talked about this with Mary Nicholas?
I have. She's great. I quote her at length in the book. And people listening, she has a memoir. She has a manuscript. Publish it. It's really good. She's got more on Bella Dodd than anybody. She's a retired MD. She knows what she's doing. I've read her manuscript. It's really good. It should be published. My friends at Sophia, get this book, publish it. It's your kind of stuff. It's important.
I understand that the talk was probably given in Orange, California, at least one of the forums.
That's
kind of like when you hear the Gospels, the four Gospels, the different angle in the same event. It has the ring of truth. No one's trying to construct complicated stories. But again, it would explain a lot. It would explain the editing of the first drafts of the Vatican II document schemas. It would explain the rise of people who were very, very wedded to what I'll call a communistic worldview, namely, let's say, Mr. Ted McCarrick, who helped with Cardinal Parolin draft the disastrous China-Vatican Accord. There's a lot of the early life of Ted McCarrick that we don't know. There's a big data void, 3 or 4 years. We have no idea where he was or what he was doing.
Theology, right?
Yeah. Liberation theology. That's right.
Theology, the tilt to the left by Jesuits, the softness on communism in the 60s. And if you do the math, she would have been doing this in the mid to latter 1930s, right? Yeah. So that's when the guys would have gone into the seminary. And I quote even Solanus Casey on this, right? No right-wing bomb thrower, right? So it would have had to have filtered down. And again, it's through that you don't get like a Marxist takeover of the church, but you get these influences where people stop and they think, how did somebody get in the Catholic Church who believes that? Right? Well, that's how it can get in.
If 10% of teachers can get in.
Right.
As you break the numbers down, it's not that unrealistic to think of someone who's either resentful of authority to begin with or who's low information.
Well, forget 10%, by the way. I quote Manning Johnson and Ben Gitlow, who Ben Gitlow is the highest defector from the party ever. And I wrote a piece on this week. It's posted up at Western Journal. They talked about 1%. They talked about, and Bella did too, and so did Louis Boudin's. It's funny, Patrick, to read their old testimony under sworn oath to Congress. And they say, the one thing that never ceases to amaze me, all we needed was like 5 or 6 people, and we could really take over the direction of an entire organization. So, and because a lot of people, we see this in society today. I saw this in my old church, Presbyterian Church, PCUSA. I'm not making a Marxism comparison here, but like the left will have an influence on a particular issue, and the conservatives, or they're not even conservatives, they're just where the church has been for 200 years. Are like, that's it, I'm leaving, I'm done, right? It's like, well, why are you doing that? There might only be 5 of them, right? You take I'm leaving. Well, stay and fight it, right? Why do you just let them? Because people don't like to fight.
Yeah, most people are not built for combat of any kind.
Right.
And you're talking about Saul Alinsky on the ground, and it's infected parish life. Some bishops fall into this. I'm not saying they deliberately follow Alinsky's rules for radicals, but these listening sessions happen where the foregone conclusion is already built in. So there's a kind of a dog and pony show that it sounds like you're getting people in small groups to listen and discuss and feedback. That's pure Alinsky. Look at the size of a cruise ship compared to the size of the rudder. The rudder's tiny compared to the mass of the ship, but it determines the direction of the whole ship.
So true. Yeah, so true. Well said. Well said. By the way, I spent time in here on Alinsky and the devil as well. And what Saul Alinsky said about Satan in that acknowledgement in the beginning of Rules for Radicals, and I must have 2 pages where I say, is this a dedication? Is it an acknowledgement? Here's what Snopes says. And I'm very careful with this too, but it's important what Alinsky said about Lucifer. He commends him as like the first rebel who bought for himself his own kingdom. And it's exactly the take of Mikhail Bakunin, who was a nasty, vicious, vitriolic atheist and socialist anarchist, which even confused Marx, right? Marx is like, how can you be a socialist and an anarchist?
This is too complicated for me.
That's exactly right. Sorry about my phone ringing. But
I'm a Christian, I forgive you.
But yeah, so Bakunin and Alinsky both referred to Marx as like this glorious first rebel who, he fought against God. He earned himself his own kingdom. Yeah. So Bakunin liked that. And And that's how Alinsky refers to the devil. And not just that, he makes a couple of other statements about would rather go to hell after he dies, because he'd rather be there organizing the have-nots. And it's an interview with Playboy. And the Playboy interviewer is like, really? Why would you say that?
And there's no detectable tongue-in-cheek with comments like that.
I had a friend of mine who's a liberal, and she said, oh, he's speaking tongue-in-cheek. And I said, how do you know that? Do you have magical
soul reading apparatus?
Right. Yeah, right. Do you realize? I know he liked to joke and be a wise guy and had a mordant sense of humor. So did Marx. And I admit, and I say this in the book, so sometimes it's hard to know if he's being playful, right? He's being funny. It's like, oh, that's really funny, right? But there's other times where it's funny. The guy they want to defend, they'll be like, oh yeah, here when Marx uses the N-word here, right? We really shouldn't take him literally, right? But John Wayne said something, 50 years ago. You better rename that airport now.
You got to cancel him. You got to cancel Flannery O'Connor.
And Margaret Sanger spoke to the Silver Lake, New Jersey chapter of the KKK in May 1926. How do we know about that? Pages 366 to 367 of her memoirs, right? And her protectors were like, well, the KKK in that day, they weren't just about blacks.
They're more like Democrat Party members, like Robert Byrd.
It was on everything, right? Why this charity all of a sudden, right?
It's selective amnesia, selective editing and attention. Let me linger on one person here for a moment, because we're talking about the title, The Devil and Karl Marx, and the very disturbing life of Kate Millett, the proto-feminist, second wave 1960s icon of feminism. I had to read her books when I was in university. Pretty hard left stuff. And it's just, I don't even have the words to describe the miasma of weird darkness surrounding the things that she said, the way she said it. And her sister Mallory has written very frankly about her sister's maybe clinical depression, probably satanic possession or infestation. Who's Kate Millett?
Yeah, in fact, you should have Mallory on your show. Mallory's very accomplished, did some acting, a very devout Catholic. Kate Millett she wrote the book Sexual Politics, which was her dissertation at, where else? Columbia, right? 1968, 69. She was on the cover of Time magazine, where she was referred to as the Mao Zedong of the women's movement. So she was very prominent. And by the way, one of the things that Mallory, her sister, told me, she said, Paul, one thing I'll never get over in my life is how my sister, who was crazy, like clinically crazy, and Mallory believes that her sister was demonically possessed, how she could write a book like this. And I've tried to read the book. Like so many of these writings, it's just impenetrable. It's just 300 pages of wasted ink and nonsense. And Mallory said, how does a book end up like that? End up in the syllabi and the curriculum of every university of America within 3 years. And I find myself like screaming, she would say, saying, if you all only knew what Kate is like, you wouldn't be reading this.
Right.
You shouldn't be taking her words seriously. And yet here it was, it became like, the Marxist anti-patriarch gospel. It was the book Sexual Politics. And Mallory said, my sister was deeply disturbed. And yet she had these acolytes and still does to this day.
How did she die?
She died very recently, in the last couple of years. She died from a heart attack in her hotel room in Paris alongside her wife. By the way, as Catholics, it's hard for us to say her wife, right? That would violate our
the one she thought she was married to.
But she had been married to a man at one point, and it was part of Kate's Marxist-inspired kind of sexual, gender, cultural rebellion that left her to eventually leave her husband and eventually become bisexual, and eventually, for Kate and people listening, don't get angry. This is sexual politics. Kengor, that's the name of her book. Her book was called Sexual Politics. They ideologized, they politicized sexuality and gender and all that stuff. And they did so from a Marxist perspective. I'm so tired of this, Patrick. People looking at guys like us like we're crazy, right? You should hear this guy on Patrick Coffin's show. He's talking about sexual Marxism. We've read their stuff. This is what they are. This is what they write about. This was the field that they pioneered. Wilhelm Reich, who wrote the book, The Sexual Revolution, was a Freudian Marxist trying to create a field, a unified field of Freudian Marxist theory. It's not our fault that you guys don't know this stuff, all right? Read it. Read your own people.
I beg you, don't believe us. Believe them.
Right.
Read them.
Read their stuff.
Paul, let me finish, just return to Marx just for a moment, and how there's a massive gap here. Because your book is so comprehensive and so detail-oriented. I'm counting 500 plus footnotes in this thing. The footnotes themselves are going to cause a problem because now I've got another stack of books I have to read. But the gap between what Marx wrote and the life that he led. He was poor his entire life. He was a master manipulator. Why Engels didn't leave him a dozen times is hard to discern. It's almost like Marx had something on Engels, or Engels was literally afraid of him, kept ponying up cash for him, extending deadlines and money and so on. Marx himself was stricken with bizarre, probably painful carbuncles for many years all over his anatomy. He was excessively dirty. He lived in squalor most of his life, put his wife and kids through hell. His wife and daughters had so much sorrow, how he treated them.
Yeah, he even said, Engels, my poor wife, she's so miserable. There's not a day that goes by that she doesn't wish that she were with the children in their graves. Ugh. And so many of the Marx children died before Marx and his wife did. And two of his daughters committed suicide in suicide pacts with their husbands. And in some of Marx's poetry, he writes about suicide pacts. Yeah, and I know people watching, right, we all have tragedy in our family lives, and people in their families have dealt with suicide. Patrick, I don't know anybody else that I've ever heard of in my own life or community or in the history of whatever who had two daughters commit suicide in suicide pacts with their husbands. All right, this is Marx. This is and one of the suicide pacts was his daughter's Laura. Her husband, Paul Lafargue, who was partly Cuban. So Marx said, oh, partly Cuban, then he's partly Negro. And you know what I think about Negroes? So he called him Negrillo, or the gorilla. And he and Engels have some letters back and forth where they're making fun of him. They're talking about his cranial size or comparing him to apes and monkeys. They were strict evolutionists, very racist. Very racist, very sexist, very anti-Semitic. I wrote a piece for the American Spectator called "Why Not Cancel Karl Marx?" If you want cancel culture, this guy, you can't find quotes from Washington and Jefferson and Columbus like you can find from this guy page after page.
100%. That's a really good point.
Page after page.
Yeah.
But yeah, a really miserable existence. He was, I go on and on, could not put a roof over his family's head, cheated on his wife with a family nursemaid, who he got pregnant, refused to acknowledge that the child was his. They named the child Freddie after Friedrich. So he pretended to have paternity for it, never paid a penny of child support to the kid, never paid a penny to the family nursemaid, just on and on and on. This guy... The type of world that Marx was trying to create, Patrick, was one where a guy like him could sit around on his carbunkled bottom all day and fulminate and rage against the world in a library or Ivy Tower somewhere and have everybody else pay for it. That would have been an ideal world for him.
Twitter's built for him. Distilling everything into "I love you."
He'd be great on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Abolition of the family! Exclamation mark, right?
You have to add that word out, abolition of everything.
Right. Man makes God. Opium of the masses, right? Tear it down, right?
Full-on
Everything that exists
iconoclasm.
is to perish. Yeah. Wow, Marxist Twitter account.
The book is The Devil and Karl Marx. I'm going to link to it at patrickcoffin.media. It's going to be just another great resource for my upcoming book on the little book of isms, forward by Michael J. Knowles. Sounds vaguely familiar to me. Mike Knowles writes the forward to the book. It's not just a book of bad news, although there's lots of disturbing content that you really have to get in front of you. You have to understand what the enemy's up to, what they say in their own words, in their own context. And they don't hide the agenda or the plan of action. They have MBO, management by objectives. So as followers of Jesus Christ, what is our MBO? What are our objectives? Do we have a distilled version of what we are and who we want to be? Yes, it's called Scripture and the Catechism. So the more you dig into the words of the communist leaders and founders, you realize that the church is way ahead of them, as in so many other things. Thanks for writing the book, Paul. Thanks for your time today. And something that's been on my mind, maybe we can lead with this, something I learned from Lieutenant Paul Clay, a black Catholic retired sheriff in the LA County Sheriff's Department. And he has a lot of street engagement experience with BLM types. And he said it as a kind of throwaway line. It's that the devil has a father wound.
Oh, wow.
So you think,
wow.
Smash the patriarchy.
Marx had a father wound.
Marx had
too,
a father wound. Didn't go to his funeral and so on. Lots have been written on that as well. Smash the patriarchy as a slogan is code for kill the father, isn't it? And tied into non serviam of the devil. So that's the red bow I'm going to put in our conversation today, Paul Kengor.
Yeah. I will end it there, but I will tell people, arm yourself with the full armor of God and with the truth. And yeah, I know this is ugly, sordid stuff. If you don't like reading it, imagine spending several years researching it. Imagine all the intellectual sewage I had to plow through in compiling this.
So we wouldn't have to.
And you use this to try to help proclaim the truth and make a better world. And above all, to educate the youth, because they do not know any of this stuff. They do not know it, and it's been out there. Yeah.
Fantastic. I always learned a ton, as I did today. The Devil and Karl Marx is the book, forward by Michael Knowles. Check out patrickcoffin.media. Pick up your copy there. Give it to your leftist friends, just to vex and annoy him or her. Thanks, Paul.
All right. Thanks, Patrick.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Check out coffinnation.com. In the meantime, be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.